I think I've shared with you before that I grew up on a small farm in Midwestern Ontario in Bentinck Township in Grey County, to be exact. And if there was a contest for the hilliest, rockiest township in the province of Ontario, Bentinck Township would certainly be in the running. Looking back, I have no idea how my parents made a living and raised a family on that farm. Our house and the other farm buildings were nestled into the side of one hill in a valley, actually, with large hills on both sides. And then, as a young minister at the age of 24, I was sent to Grimshaw, Alberta, which is a 6-hour drive north of Edmonton, for my first church. And while there, I not only got used to, but actually came to love the flatness of the prairie with its endless horizon and its big sky. But what I did miss about living in a valley was that feeling of security and comfort that came from being embraced and protected by those hills. Now, I think that most people would say that it's really virtually impossible to look toward a range of mountains on a clear day and not be awestruck by the beauty and the strength and the grandeur. But apparently that's actually not true, because I have a friend whose father, who was born and raised on the prairies, would often say that, well, mountains are fine as far as that goes, but they sure get in the way of the view. And still others, mostly those of us from the East, may have a hard time adjusting to the flatness of the prairies. And that reminds me of the person who described Saskatchewan as a place where you can spend the whole day watching your dog run away. And so the thing is, and this shouldn't be surprising to us, the thing is that different people respond differently to the same geographical features. Our response, whether it's a feeling of anxiety and fear, or whether it's a feeling of comfort and relief, seems to depend a lot on what we're used to. Well, the Hebrew people were used to mountains. And with a few exceptions, the mountains that people of biblical times were familiar with tended to be rather arid peaks rising out of a desert landscape. But like most mountains, those features were hard to ignore. They were hard to miss. In fact, they were the setting of many significant events in both Jewish scripture and later on in Christian scripture. See how many of these you recognize. Everybody knows the story of Noah and the flood, and we know that after the great flood, Noah's ark landed on top of Mount Ararat. Most of us know that Moses climbed Mount Sinai to have a little chat with God and came down with the 10 Commandments. When David decided to build a temple for his God, he built it on a mountain, albeit a small one, known as Mount Zion. When the prophet Elijah challenged the priests of Baal to a contest, the venue chosen was the heights of Mount Carmel. And from the prophet Isaiah, the holy mountain represents the new Jerusalem, where the former ways of violence and death and greed and threat and exile give way to new possibilities of justice and peace. And then moving to the New Testament, the story of Jesus includes mountains too. When the woman at the well had a religious discussion with Jesus, she made the point that while the Jews worshiped God in Jerusalem, she and her fellow Samaritans worshiped on top of Mount Gerizim. And when Matthew, the gospel writer, gathered together some of Jesus' teachings and presented them as if they were part of a single speech, he chose a mountain as the setting for that. Hence, what we've come to know as the Sermon on the Mount. And an irrelevant but interesting fact is that Luke, another gospel writer, had the same event taking place on a plain. The Bible is, after all, a very human book. We know that Jesus spent the night before his death in a garden outside Jerusalem on what amounts to a big hill known as the Mount of Olives. And even a small bump on the landscape called Golgotha, aka Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, at least achieved the status of a hill. And to top it off, so to speak, yeah, I made that up. To top it off, excuse me, when Jesus had a mystical experience, which we heard about in our reading for this morning, an experience that we call the Transfiguration, the gospel writers set the scene on a mountaintop. And so we still talk today about having mountaintop experiences. Now, leaving aside the question of whether or not all of these incidents qualify as historical events, let alone ones that actually took place on a mountain, the important question is why? Why did the biblical writers imagine that mountains were suitable places for significant things like these to happen? Well, I suppose we could say that it was at least partly because they associated mountains with the divine. Certainly, the Hebrew people were not unique in this regard. Many people throughout history have believed that gods live in specific locations. And when you believe in a flat earth, with the earth down here and heaven literally up here, as they did, then of course it's natural to think of gods living on mountaintops. Because short of becoming airborne, that's about as close to heaven as people can get. Hence, for the Greeks, the gods lived on Mount Olympus, while in other parts of the world, gods spoke out of the mouths of volcanoes. So if you wanted to be close to God, then get yourself up a mountain. If you wanted to find out how God wanted you to live, then you went up a mountain, you had a little chin wag with God, and you came back with the 10 Commandments. And if you wanted to have a mystical, transformational, transcendent experience, then a mountaintop where the air is definitely thinner was a pretty good place to have it. Now, of course, people's ideas about mountains and people's ideas about God have changed over the years. The Hebrew people eventually came to realize that God is not confined to any specific location, not to a mountaintop, not to a temple in Jerusalem, not to anywhere else. And as for mountains, well, it took the Romantic movement of the 18th century for poets and painters and composers to really appreciate the beauty of mountains. Until then, my friend's father would probably have been right. Mountains just get in the way of everything. They get in the way of the view, they get in the way of the journey, they get in the way of everything. In fact, they didn't just spoil the view, they were sometimes impediments to travel. They were obstacles to get over or through or around. And that, it seems, is the idea of a mountain that the late, great Marvin Gaye had in mind when he declared that there ain't no mountain high enough to keep him away from his sweetheart. And over time, of course, people did come to appreciate the beauty and the majesty of the purple-headed mountain, to quote a very familiar children's hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. Which makes me think that the gut response of ancient people to mountains, the sense that these were the dwelling places of the gods, that when they lifted their eyes to the hills, they would find a source of wisdom and help, a la Psalm 121. Unto the hills around do I lift up my longing eyes. That all of that expresses a feeling, a human feeling, that even with our post-flat Earth world view, I had to practice that, we have not entirely lost. Marvin Gaye's song, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, speaks of mountains as potential obstacles that keep us apart. But think of other songs of our time that see mountains not as obstacles at all, but as sources of inspiration and symbols of the things to which we aspire. And this is a bit of a test for the musicians. Gonna build a mountain. That was the task that a character set himself in a musical of the 1960s, a musical called Stop the World, I Want to Get Off. This one's more familiar. Around the same time, in a better known musical, I think we'll all get this, Rodgers and Hammerstein challenged us to climb every mountain till we find our dream. The Sound of Music. More recently, songs have addressed a significant figure in a singer's life with words like, I want to stand with you on a mountain. And of course, you raise me up so I can stand on mountains. We may no longer believe in a flat earth. And many of us no longer think of heaven as a literal place, literally up there. And yet the things to which we aspire, when you think about it, still seem to take on a kind of a vertical dimension. Standing, for example, in a grand Gothic cathedral where those long, slender columns and arches draw our eyes upward, which was the intention, after all, can still inspire us with thoughts of the holy. And the same thing with every tall, pointed steeple and spire adorning many churches. That's why those steeples are there, to draw our eyes up. And the sight of a mountain can still cause us to lift our eyes as it lifts our spirits. And we still speak of having mountaintop experiences. And people of faith can still identify with those beautiful words from Psalm 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, from whence cometh my help. In a literal sense, it may be true that there ain't no mountain high enough to be God's actual dwelling place. Even a mountain cannot encompass the reality that we call God, or the divine, or the holy. But a mountain can fill us with a sense of awe and majesty. A mountain can lift us out of ourselves and make us conscious of our smallness in the presence of a thing of such grandeur. A mountain can speak to us of the wonders of creation. And a mountain can still inspire us and cause our souls to sing. Thanks be to God.